sure to check out the Aardvark and the Magic Moshi Do Red Dwarf podcast, available on Spotify. Fans of the sci-fi comedy series Red Dwarf can enjoy weekly episode breakdowns and amazing conversations with special guests. And a very special thank you to our Patreon subscribers. Hello and welcome to another episode of Horrific Heroes. I'm Steve, and with me as always, our lovely friend Rob.
Hey
Hello, Rob.
everybody, how's it going?
How you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Survived your trip back from Oz?
Oh yeah. Yeah. This time. Yeah, this time.
It's
It
like,
was a
yeah,
little rough. It was a little rougher this time than the first time.
yeah. Well, the Yellow Brick Road was a little worse for wear this time around.
Right.
Yeah. So that doesn't give it away. We are talking about the 1985 film Return to Oz, which was not one I grew up with. But did you watch this when it had come out?
Oh yeah, yeah. In 1985, I was 11 when it came out. So I definitely saw it. Probably not in theater, but I probably saw it on video not too long after it, or on cable at the time. It would probably been mostly on cable.
Disney
Um,
Channel at the time, right? Because Disney Channel had been a thing from the 80s, right? Is that sort of when it started?
Yeah, but during the 80s, Disney Channel was a pay channel. It wasn't part of the basic package like it was
Right.
later on. So Disney Channel was one of those extra things. And my parents didn't really pay for the extras too much.
Yeah,
They
yeah. It
did
was like a
HBO, but
premium.
never really, yeah, it was a premium kids channel.
It was HBO for
So
kids at that point.
yeah, exactly.
All right. So, for those that don't know, Return to Oz is a sequel to the 1939 Wizard of Oz.
Yep.
It's based on two of Baum's books. So, for people that don't know, so the Wizard of Oz is a long series of books. It's got like
Yeah,
10 or more of them in there.
right.
So this is a combination of the marvelous Land of Oz and Ozma of Oz. So it's sort of a continuation of Dorothy's journey. But yeah, so Return to Oz is sort of notorious for being really messed up for a kids movie.
Yeah, very true, very true. Yeah, it's one of those. It's what we now call 80s kinder trauma, and
Yeah.
I'm actually doing a series on movies like this. And my first episode just came out on Creepy and Geeky with Return to Oz and the Never Ending Story. So this is a nice little bit of synergy with these two shows.
Yeah, so if you all want to know why Gen X is so messed up, this is why.
This is only part of it, but yeah,
So, but obviously
there's a
after you
lot
watch
that
this,
messes us up.
so after you guys watch this, definitely go check out Rob's series on because yeah, the Never Ending Story's got some got some stuff in it too.
Yeah,
The damn
yeah,
horse, man.
you're
That I
right.
saw as a
And
kid. That
yeah,
one messed me up as a guy. I saw that on VHS,
yeah, yeah.
but this one just sort of never came across my radar.
You were probably better for it.
Probably still freaked me out a bit as an adult. So like, right? So
Yeah,
do we categorize this as horror? I think so.
I
Angel and I
think
get to
so.
this conversation, and this is sort of the premise of Horrific Heroes is like, funny enough, the horror genre was never called horror until much later. There's so much like you talk about like gothic stories, dark
Yeah,
fantasy. There's so much that you would really categorize as horror, but we don't tend to put that label on it.
right.
But let's dive in to Return to Oz. So we open up to a worse for wear Kansas farmhouse. This is 6 months after the twister that sent Dorothy to
Right.
Oz the first time. The house is damaged, the farm's all destroyed. There's no workers around. It's just Aunt
No.
Em, Uncle Henry, and Dorothy.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're definitely they're doing bad financially. They're I guess the farm isn't producing. Not really a happy spot,
No.
for this family. How did you feel sort of like this reintroduction to Dorothy's family?
It was it's interesting given, the ending of the first movie. And I mean, because the first movie is, while it has its moments where you can consider it kind of scary,
Mhm.
that this one takes a much darker tone throughout. And this one, rather than where the first one had dark moments, it was mostly a lighter movie.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, and it it seemed more upbeat.
Well,
Whereas
yeah, it's an
this
MGM
one just
musical.
starts on a
Yeah.
yeah, and this one just starts as a downer. Yeah, it's not a musical, it's just a straight up adaptation. And it's a lot darker right from the start because yeah, they're doing poorly. Auntie M is like talking about how Uncle Henry he got his leg hurt, but it should be healed by now, and he's just kind of milking it. Um,
Yeah.
I really find it funny too, and we talked about this briefly on Twitter. Was that Auntie M this time is played by Piper Laurie,
Yeah,
who
horror
most
legend.
people, yeah,
Yeah.
who most people recognize playing the mom from Carrie.
Yeah,
So
Mrs. White.
yeah, so it's a little like when you realize it, you're like, wait, no, that's not good.
Well, you know
So
what's so funny? And I thought on first because I didn't realize how similar she looked to Debbie Reynolds. So for a second, when
yeah,
she first popped up on screen, I was like, "Is that Debbie Reynolds?" No, it's Piper Laurie. I didn't realize they look so similar. Or at least, to
right.
me, I'm like, I don't know if that's just me losing it.
No,
But
I would say they look similar enough that yeah, you can make that mistake
right, it
fairly,
was like the curly, it was like the
upon
haircut
first.
going
Yeah,
on, but yeah. So the family's not doing well. Poor Dorothy's depressed. She's not
yeah,
sleeping, so her reality post Twister is sort of just not, it's not Oz, right?
yeah,
So there's a sense of she's missing Oz, she's not sleeping,
yeah.
her family's broke, the farm's not
Nobody
producing,
believes her
nobody
about
believes
Oz
her.
either. Yeah,
Yeah, so there's a real like mental health component here as well, and I
yeah,
think it's a really cool metaphor for depression here, right?
yeah,
Of like not believing people when they're talking about what
yeah,
they're experiencing, not just obviously
yeah.
this trip to Oz, but also did they explain
Well,
why her uncles were gone or like the workers? I can't. Do you remember
I
why
don't. I think it's just because they can't afford it
they can't afford
anymore.
to keep
They
them
just
around?
the because the farm isn't producing, then they just can't keep the workers around now.
Right, right,
But I do think it's interesting too to go into what you're saying about like the things with mental health and everything. There's this layer of, you know, nobody believes her. They think that, it's all this little fantasy she concocted on her in her own head when she was
right,
knocked out from the tornado, which, there's a certain level of in this movie, it feels more like, is this real? Is this just her dreaming and imagining these things? So there's this whole unreliable
yeah.
narrator thing going on in this as well. That I noticed.
So I think this
The
is,
first,
yeah. No, go
yeah,
ahead.
the first one you get swept up into the whole thing, but this time it's very, very like pointedly going, is she really going here? Or is this all in her head and she really should be committed?
Right,
So,
right. Oh, it is so interesting. I think with and this is the longest, yeah, this is the point I was gonna make. This is the longest, I think, first act where we don't go to Oz. I feel like we spend a good chunk of time in Kansas before we even get any Oz action. I'll have to go look and see how long it takes for Dorothy to land in
yeah,
Munchkinland the first time compared to this one because like you said they spend a long time sort of wrapping you into this like what is going on for her.
yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and
It's
so
it's
we
it's very odd for sure.
yeah and so we find out that they signed her up to work with Dr. Worley, um, which is I guess however long away from where they are in Kansas. She goes with Ann M to cure her of her delusions. Um,
Right.
so we go and we're introduced to his version of the Tin Man, so to speak. And she's gonna get
Yeah.
electroshock therapy,
Yeah.
which is wild. So he's like saying like, "Oh yeah, this machine, it's got eyes and a tongue and a nose and ears." I'm like, "All right, dude." I don't know if this is it almost reminded me of like how like doctors now will like they'll show the child like a
Yeah.
syringe and be like you don't have to be scared of it. It was like that was what he was
Right.
trying to do, but I'm like you're about to electrocute this girl.
Right? Like it's so crazy too because like look, like I get it that there were some like doctors were experimenting and trying new things and they didn't really know
Mhm.
what they were doing. They were just trying to find out ways to help people, I think.
Right. Well, this is
I
1899, so they didn't quite have
1899, so
the knowledge we
right.
have.
Right. You know, the problem with a lot of what they did was they experimented on people,
Yeah.
until they figured out what worked and what didn't work. And, you know, when you look back on it, you're like, "Well, that's really actually horrible." But, you know, at the time, they weren't I don't think most doctors were going into it with, sinister reasons, and he doesn't seem to be very sinister in himself. He does seem to be wanting to actually help her out.
Oh,
So
sure, sure. You know, you don't. I think it's just sort of the situation is so
right,
bizarre, right? Where you can see like
right,
where they would think this could help,
right.
but I think it adds to the creepiness that they genuinely cast an age appropriate Dorothy here. You
Yeah,
know, because when
yeah,
we had Judy Garland in
right,
39, I mean, she was young, but she looked like a teenager. She looked like
right.
almost an adult. So this is like a preteen, like was she's like 12 or
Yeah,
13?
12 years old, I think, yeah.
Yeah, so this is like an age accurate Dorothy. So it feels
Right.
extra sinister at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, because she was around 10 to 12 in the books. And so yeah, you would they've actually cast an actress this time. You know, and it makes sense. Judy Garland for a musical and stuff like that, they
Mhm.
wanted somebody who could sing well and everything. But you know, definitely casting somebody at that age definitely lends a lot more creepiness to it than the first time around. Especially just in this movie. This movie just has so many creepy aspects to it that you're just like again, the 80s were wild,
Yeah.
man.
Well, I mean, the first like get go, you know, getting into creepiness is like they're so Ann M leaves, and then Nurse Wilson comes in to show Dorothy to her room.
Right.
Tells her to take a nap or whatever. But we get a real look at this asylum and like the
Yeah.
creepy hallways and how sort of
There's people
dilapidated.
screaming, other patients are
Yeah.
screaming in the background and everything. Yeah.
I tell you, like the whole asylum bit really actually got under my skin, even as an adult. So I'm like, I can imagine
Yeah.
like as a kid seeing a
Yeah.
child going into this place, how that would feel. Like this creeped me out.
Yeah. And she was handling it pretty well, all things considered.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, obviously, you know, it's a movie, so you know, she's obviously not that scared. But and here's the thing too, like I want to like it's something upon, you know, thinking about it this time is that, you know, they try to make because we get into this later, but they try to make it seem like the nurse and the orderlies who are wheeling around the gurneys and stuff that they are creepy and weird.
Hmm.
And I can see that from a certain point of view, like maybe from a kid's point of view, they might be, but they really weren't that bad. Like they weren't like torturing her or doing anything to her that like seemed really awful. Like for the most part, you know, it's just they were kind of stern and just like, you know, you need to do what we say, you know, and
Yeah.
that was all it was, you know, just yeah, I just think it's funny that they, you know, upon, you know, later events in the movie that they like made it seem like they were a lot more evil than they were. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, especially if you think of like, from a child's perspective, everything is going to seem
right,
scarier, right?
right,
Especially from a 12-year-old, like, you're going to this asylum, your family's really dropping you off there. There's
right,
these doctors and nurses you don't know. Everything looks sort
right.
of creepy and like, um, there's this big machine that's going to shock you coming up, like, and
Well,
then
and
so
she's not used to electricity. She's in this room
true.
and she actually turns on a light and she doesn't even know what that is because she doesn't have electricity. So, you
Yeah.
know, it's very interesting this whole like turn of the century where technology is becoming something new and everything. So, you know,
Which I think
it's very
definitely
interesting.
plays into the themes of the movie as we get
Oh
into,
yeah, for
our
sure.
main sort of antagonist and that whole element. So when she's in the room, I think this is the first time, yeah, she's visited by this mysterious girl.
Right.
Right. So we don't really we don't get her name yet.
Yeah.
But she wants to help her escape.
Right.
And so the nurse comes in and they're just like, we're gonna strap you down on this gurney. We're gonna take you in for your procedure. So the
Right.
girl sort of does the girl go with her down with the gurney, or the girl sort of disappears at this point?
The girl disappears.
She
Yeah.
disappears, right? Yeah, so she's not
Yeah.
really going down with her other girl. They're going to strap her in, take her to this machine, and so we sort of get this like lead up, going down this creepy hallway. It's shot very beautifully.
Yeah.
Let's say like this is a beautiful movie from
Yeah.
right, just from like the
For
sets and
Yeah, for a movie that's like, you go from the like the technicolor like fantasy of Wizard of Oz and you're coming to this movie, even when you go into Oz, everything's more realistic and more kind of you know, just muted.
yeah.
So it's definitely not as and we'll get into that in a little bit about why it's muted, but it does make it, but it is shot well. I mean, there's definitely it's set in real areas. Like that's the fun thing about it, is like in the first movie it's all sets,
Hmm.
stages and stuff, whereas in this movie when they're outside.
Yeah.
So
It's very grounded.
they're
It's not sort of, yeah, this,
yeah.
MGM Technicolor sort
Right.
of musical, right?
Right.
It's almost like it's the middle ground between like this is a weird comparison, but I'm thinking like X and Pearl, right? You have X
Yeah.
is gritty, Pearl is a throwback to those old movies, so it's kind of like we're meeting in the middle in terms of that
Right.
aesthetic, and that
Exactly.
texture of the film. But yeah, so the girl shows up. I mean, they're putting her in. They're strapping her to the machine. So this mysterious girl shows up. There's a power outage, and then they flee the asylum. They're out into
Right.
the storm. Nurse Wilson's chasing them, and they come upon like a river. So that's kind of this is our, which is quite an interesting sort of, because now we're getting, this is how they get to Oz, right?
Right.
Is through this river in this big storm that's happening. It's a very like, I don't want to say like grittier way to get to Oz. It's very chaotic. It's very
Yeah. Yeah.
in a different way than say like the Twister.
It's it's not as fantastical. It's very realistic. Like, and that's again, this is where this notion of her mental state and everything like that really, to me, comes into play, because we're in the first movie, the tornado whips her up and
Mhm.
she's pretty safe in the house,
Yeah,
and
whimsical. There's like things
yeah.
flying around her, and
And so in the new in Return to Oz, she's whisked away. She falls into the river with this girl. The girl vanishes.
mhm.
Presumably, like real world, she's probably dead. And then she manages to climb on to something like some kind of furniture that's floating by, and manages to stay safe, but she's still like being whisked away on the river. It's so much a different, more like a realistic, like just kind of terrible way to do this. And she just
Yeah,
happens to wake up in Oz this time, and so it's just,
yeah.
again, this, like I said, it goes into her mental state about like, is this real, or is this just a fantasy she's concocting to kind of deal with the trauma of this event?
Right, because when she does get to Oz, she's sort of, she found safety in like this chicken coop, right?
Right.
This like
Yeah, chicken coop, there you
this
go.
chicken coop, and so the way that she gets to Oz, you're not immediately hit over the head with like bright technicolor yellows,
No.
reds, blues, greens, right? She's just sort of in a puddle with a chicken, and
Yeah.
and it does not, you're like, okay, like it doesn't feel like she's gone anywhere. You think maybe she just like ended up somewhere down the river, uh until the chicken talks to her.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's when we were introduced to Belina the chicken.
Right.
um
Well, we were introduced to Belina earlier.
oh,
Belina's a
true.
chicken that was on the farm that could not, it was not laying eggs.
Right, right,
And
right.
so
Thank you.
it becomes a plot point the whole movie that she's just an older chicken that just can't lay eggs.
Over the hill, Belina.
Yeah.
Who, that's right. This is, I guess, we're introduced to her as a character at this point, right? Like,
Right.
right.
And
So,
she's and so we get a lot of weird analogs this time
mhm,
to previous characters. So in this instance, Belina is her new Toto. Toto still exists, don't get me wrong, but this is on her journey into Oz. Belina is her Toto this time.
right, right. Toto, yeah, Toto's not, yeah, not on the journey this time.
Yeah.
We moved to the chicken, which is representing the failing farm. So and then we sort of see them. So they're kind of going through the forest. Well, they realize that they're at the Deadly Desert. Is sort of where they landed because water does not survive at the Deadly Desert.
Right.
They're in this puddle and they see like sort of the water going away. We get little hints that they're being watched, right? Because there's faces showing up in the rocks at the Deadly Desert. And then they're able to sort of hop towards the forest to head to the Emerald City,
Right.
which is it's so funny that they sort of ended up there much quicker this time than in the original movie. That the whole point was to get to the Emerald
Right.
City. Here we're getting to the Emerald City pretty quickly.
Right.
Um, but
Well,
yeah,
I do think it's interesting too because before she gets to the Emerald City, she finds her house, the house that she dropped in on.
the house that landed.
Um
Yeah,
yeah. So again, this house that actually still exists in the real world now because it did go back, when she woke up in the last one, the house is still there. It might have been a
it was
little
being like renovated. Right, they were
it was
building on.
being yeah, they were
Yeah,
fixing it up. So it's interesting that the house was, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was a part of the house that did get wrenched up and was no longer in Kansas through everything.
yeah.
I
I
don't know.
wonder.
So
Yeah, maybe yeah, because right now you're sort of wondering. It's like, well, clearly the house was there when she woke up in 1990,
yeah,
in the original movie.
right.
Um,
So it
so
is a little odd again. Why does the house that's actually still at home?
mhm.
How is that still in Oz? Because it's broken down a lot more, and it's the house that drops on the Wicked Witch of the east or west, whichever one she got the ruby slippers from.
Right,
Um,
right.
so
And then we
so
sort of
it's just
see. Okay.
well, then we see the remnants of the yellow brick road, which has been torn up and
Yeah.
and faded and everything. So
Well,
which then
Munchkin
leads her
Land is
to
gone too,
Emerald.
right? We see the
Yeah,
house that's
yeah.
fallen, but there are no Munchkins to be seen.
No Munchkins. Yeah, no. This is again. We're getting to a much darker, you know, tone. We're not starting off with songs and and lots of Technicolor stuff. It's very very earth tone, muted. Everything. The yellow brick road is just like literally just a painted yellow like sidewalk. So
Although, to be fair, it's quite funny when you think about her getting to Oz. That everyone was singing over a dead woman's body, but
yeah.
it is very dark when you think about it. But
No, no, there's definitely some darkness to it.
hell yeah, so we see sort of the yellow brick road is just sort of all chipped away. The bricks are coming out of the ground. It's all torn up. And so her and Belina sort of take that road to
Yeah.
the Emerald City, which again, not as vibrant as
No.
Munchkin Land, right? So there's buildings that are sort of destroyed. The vibrant
Right.
emerald is gone, right? So all that green
Right.
color is gone. They come across sort of graffiti that says "Beware the Wheelers." So we get
Yeah.
an inkling that something is amiss here. This
Right.
this go around, and people have been turned to stone.
Yes.
Right. So something happened, and
Well, and
so
she comes upon, not just regular people, but both the Tin Man and the Cowardly Lion are both there in stone as well.
yeah, yeah,
So two of her biggest friends from the first adventure are now, just stone, just
yeah.
there.
Just her and her chicken, and then we
Yeah.
get and now she's but now we know we don't know where the scarecrow is. Uh but we do eventually get, well, first we get, I think this is when we first see our wheelers, which are what a wild design, right?
Yeah.
So it's people presumably on like stilts, right? But they have wheels for hands and legs.
Yeah.
And at first you can't tell that they're human because we
Because
don't
they
see
have a weird,
they have a
yeah.
face on their helmet.
Yeah.
So when they're
And well,
flipping.
and you don't realize it's a helmet either at first.
No.
Because when they pull up, it just looks like a weird like mask face.
Yeah, and they're
So
creepy.
they are.
They
They
really.
are.
Yeah, so this is our first inkling of like what's in store for us here in this new version of Oz. Is the creatures. I mean, the flying monkeys can be creepy,
Yeah.
but things are definitely a lot darker in design.
Yeah, oh
I mean,
yeah.
it's still sort of whimsical because they sort of have like this like patched up, almost like I don't know. It's almost like a Michael Jackson costume. Some
Well,
of their
so
outfits, right?
so this is something we talked about on my show as well, too. And they're kind of like kind of 80s glam clowns.
Yes.
So and just a weird little punk glam aesthetic that kind of goes throughout most of the villains in this movie. There's
Yeah.
this weird, and it's like, it's almost like, I don't know if they were intending it to be this way, but it was almost like, you know, this era is bad. Like, let's go back to the aesthetic of early America, because all this stuff with all the neon colors and the makeup and the hair and everything, no, that's bad.
Yeah. I'm almost
So,
surprised Bowie didn't show up in this movie.
well,
Like
he shows up in another 80s Kinder Trauma movie.
that, yes, yeah. Oh, so good. But yeah, so they're sort of getting chased by these wheelers, and well, we forgot to mention she finds a key to Oz
Yes,
on the farm. And that's sort of our first inkling of like her knowing, no, this was real. Like
this was
oh,
real. Yeah,
Z, this is meanwhile Aunt M's like telling her, like, oh no, that's for the house, or
yeah,
it's an old key. We probably lost it. You found it. Okay. But yeah, so she uses this key to get into one of the like part of the castle, part of the Emerald City,
right.
where she stumbles upon her first, I guess, our replacement for the Scarecrow, or Tin Man rather,
Yeah,
TikTok, the OG TikTok.
yeah,
I love TikTok. He's so fun, and so this whole
yeah.
thing is, so she finds that he has 3 gears that she has to wind up to get him going,
Right,
and so this again feels very akin to Wizard of Oz, right? Because it's like, there's a gear for thinking, a gear for speech, and a gear for movement.
right.
Sort of
Which
all
she's
three ways we
which come
engage
into
with the world.
Yeah, and they
Sorry, sorry,
come
sorry.
into play. They each come into play in very, like, inopportune moments.
Yeah.
So,
And so she winds him up, and he sort of fills her in what's been going on. So we get our exposition that the Gnome King has taken over Oz. Mombi, the evil witch, has imprisoned Princess Ozma, the rightful ruler of Oz. And then I guess that Gnome King has taken Scarecrow.
right,
Right. So we sort of get our MacGuffin. This is our journey. This is our adventure that we're
the
about to go.
hero's journey.
This
Yep,
is our
yep,
hero's journey. We've got to, yeah. So we got to take down Gnome King, Mumby, and free, everyone that's sort of been turned to stone or taken. Is this where they explain sort of the motivations from Gnome King? I don't think we got that yet here.
No, I don't think we find that out until from the Gnome King
Like,
later.
yeah, the
Yeah,
second act, third act of the movie. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, but then so Dorothy, Belina, and TikTok, go on, and they find Mumby's castle. So we get this whole bit inside her castle. Uh this almost gave me very like, I don't know, like dark Alice in Wonderland vibes. I had a
oh
lot of,
yeah, yeah,
right, like sort of like OG weird like children's fairy tales that were dark
yeah,
originally.
right.
Um, so we get this witch. And what do you think about Mumby?
It's creepy. She's very creepy. The fact that she has interchangeable heads,
Mm-hmm.
just it's very weird, especially because, she takes it off, she puts it in this hallway, which is lined with other heads that she's stolen
Yeah.
to be used. So,
And her whole
uh,
motivation is, well, obviously, she wants to stop them from getting to the Gnome King. But then, sort of, this is where I was almost like getting the Alice in Wonderland vibes. It was like because it was very off with her head.
off with their heads.
She
Yeah,
wants Dorothy's head to add to
yeah,
her collection. I was like, girl, just get some wigs. I don't know why you got to change
right.
your head the whole every time.
Yeah, just color your hair. It's okay.
You could change it up in other ways.
Yeah,
But so TikTok is trying to. So this is sort of our first, where we see TikTok's faults, or is that his movement runs out,
yeah,
and he's not able to help Dorothy, and so Dorothy gets
right,
thrown into, or the attic or the top of the castle,
right.
um, to be decapitated later.
Yeah, yeah.
But and then we meet our sort of scarecrow for the movie. Uh
Yes.
Jack Pumpkinhead. I love Jack Pumpkinhead too. I sort of I
Yeah.
love everyone that she sort of meets on this journey. I think they're really fun. Um,
Yeah, it's an interesting, they're interesting because each one of these characters is so similar but so different
mhm,
in a lot of ways. You know, TikTok, he's this, he's much more, in a way, he's almost more dependable than Tin Man is in the first
mhm.
one.
Oh yeah.
But he's got his own faults. Whereas Tin Man, was searching for his heart because he wanted to live and everything. Uh, TikTok prides himself on being lifeless. He's okay with being lifeless,
Yeah.
without any kind of you know agency or anything. It's very weird. It's
Yeah,
it's
it's
it's a
weird.
it's a weird like look, and each one of these characters exists in the book series and everything. So these are characters she does meet throughout her journey through the book series. So it's interesting that even the author decided to kind of change it up, but just kind of change them slightly differently.
Yeah, well, they're clearly going into like some very different human feelings and issues with these
Yeah.
characters, right? Like with TikTok, sort of this compartmentalization of like our brain, our speech, and our movement,
Right.
and sort of how we really how all three have. It's funny that his sort of curse is that he has to wind them all up separately, right?
Right.
But in a way, it's like we have to take care of
And that
ourselves,
he
right?
can't wind them up
And he
himself
can't do it
either.
himself, meaning so that he needs help. So
Yeah.
it's okay to get help when you
Yeah.
need it. I think is one read from TikTok
Yeah.
with Jack Pumpkinhead, which we forgot to mention. So she gets from the girl that visits her. She gets a jack o' lantern in
Yeah.
her room. So that's sort of our
Right.
analogy, or like that.
Right. Because it's
Our
almost
par-
Halloween at the time that she's
yeah.
put in the asylum. Yeah.
So kind of like how the three workers at the farm were Lion, Tin
Right.
Man, and Scarecrow. We sort of get
Right.
the
Well, and
um,
the key, she found that key at the thing,
mhm.
which does become important, but like it is interesting that the key, the winding up of the
Well, I
of
was
TikTok,
wondering if TikTok
everything
is
as well.
supposed to be the electroshock therapy machine
Oh, it could be.
because he
Yeah.
mentions
Could
how
be.
it has eyes and ears and a tongue, and he kind of
And he
hinted
might
at.
have had to wind that up a little bit too.
I
Like I
think
know
he
he
did
was
wind
fiddling
it
with
up.
the knobs and stuff like that. So maybe that's where
I think
she
it's
did get that.
electro
That's a
machine.
good catch. Yeah.
Yeah, is
Catch.
TikTok. So we sort of in a very similar vein to Wizard of Oz. We're
Yeah.
getting sort of these parallels between like real
Right.
things
Which
in her life.
again speaks to her mental state. Is this actually happening or is this just stuff she's imagining in her head when she's knocked out? So
Yeah. So
it
with
this that's what's really great about this series is really when you think about it, it
yeah.
it does put a really darker tone to everything that's going on. It's just like, is this poor girl really going to these places and having these fun adventures? Or is she just like really, really like just having very vivid dreams? So
I I think there's some maybe schizoid tendency.
yeah, yeah.
As my the therapist in me is like, I think there are some delusions of grandeur happening or some
Oh yeah.
delusional.
Oh, heck yes, Delusions of Grandeur. She's the hero of Oz twice
Yeah,
over after this movie. And it's just, yeah, definitely. And to be fair, I mean, she's a little girl in like, pre 1900 Kansas and
yeah,
everything. So, she's trying to escape the drudgery of of her real life and fall into this fantasy world. It makes a lot of sense.
yeah. Oh, 100%. But to get into Jack Pumpkinhead, right? So, his whole
Right.
thing, right, is that he wants to experience life before he rots. Because when she puts the pumpkin on the scarecrow body,
Right.
he's like, look for rotting. Like, and he's like, okay, good. There's like, I want to be able to do things before I rot away. And it was like, which is such a
Right.
very human thing. It's like,
Yeah.
which parallels Dorothy too, right? Because in the sense of if she's feeling like she's rotting away on this farm in Kansas, she's sort
Yeah.
of, there's not a lot happening. And that was sort of, yeah, there's a big parallel there. And that's such a relatable motivation for this character.
Right.
So we then get so kind of back to back introductions, right? Because we then use a magic powder to bring Gump to
Yeah.
life. And Gump, this is the
Our
weirdest one.
lion for the movie. Yeah.
Our lion for the movie. And this is the weirdest one too. to explain to people. So it is a reanimated head of what is
Head
it,
of a moose.
like
Yeah.
a moose head, right? It was like
Yeah.
an elk moose, something like, and
Yeah.
it,
He's a gump.
he's a gump.
Yeah.
And so they attach this head, this reanimated head, to like a
To
sleigh.
two push together couches.
Yeah, and they make a sleigh out of
Yeah.
this thing.
Yeah. And they
Um,
put like palm fronds on it to give it wings.
yeah,
Yeah.
not whimsical at all. This thing is like hobbled together so
Yeah.
so yeah, so there's, it gets sprinkled with some magic powder,
All tied
um,
together with rope.
all tied together with rope, right? I mean, that's like I mean, I'm assuming on the farm she learns how to tie a knot. So,
Right.
and so they get
Well,
into this like
maybe.
what?
I said maybe she didn't learn how to tie rope because she didn't do a very good job with it,
That's fair.
as we find out.
She tried, and
Uh,
so yeah, so they take off and they almost crash, but sort of in last second motivation or encouragement, Gump is able to get this makeshift sleigh
yes.
off the ground, and they flee Mumby's castle, and then they fly across the deadly desert.
Right.
And so this is where, because I know before we hit record there is like some deleted scenes I'm gonna have to try to find, because
Yeah.
it's in the desert, so I guess there's more that happens, and I'm gonna release the original cut. We're gonna have to start that hashtag, release the Oz
Right.
cut, for this movie, because there's some crazy things apparently
Yeah.
that were cut from this movie, like just giant like
There's
machines
like
and
a giant like steampunk like man creature. It was very weird
yeah.
looking. Yeah.
So so we head across to the Gnome King's lair here. Um so they because then they crash, right? So they're
Right.
sort of so yeah, so they're not, they don't get there safely, but they survive. Um and then we get to the Gnome King's lair, and this is sort of where we are treated with the motivation as to what really happened with Oz. So the
Right.
Gnome King is sort of the rightful owner per se of all of like the rocks and minerals and
Right.
things of Oz. And
Right.
this is where we sort of get, I guess, the real like environmental message of the movie. Um,
Yeah,
of
there's definitely some there's some deeper messages here. You can take it as that environmental
there's a
message too, but
sliver of it,
there's
I think.
yeah, yeah. Um, but there's more that comes into play later that definitely want to talk about. That's a little bit more sinister about who's really supposed to be running Oz and everything. So,
Sure, true,
uh,
true.
yeah,
So the Gnome King sort of explains, is like, they talk about stealing and all this, and he's like, oh, so you think that things that were stolen should be returned, huh? Uh
yeah.
I laughed out loud when his little feet came out with the ruby slippers. I was
He's just peeking
dying.
them out. He puts them back. He peeks them out again.
He was just sort
It's
of like
just
doing a
like
little like kick with it too, like
no, and this again, this is interesting too because this goes into the whole kind of like weird, like not necessarily glam, but there's very much there's almost like a little cross dresser thing going
hmm
on with this too. That because it's definitely a guy. He's got the beard and everything like that, but he's wearing a flowing cloak, and he's
hmm
when he's peeking out the ruby slippers, he's just instead of like just them being there, he's very purposely peeking them out very
Yeah,
daintily.
yeah.
So it definitely is an interesting, like, I don't know if they were trying to, again, this is so weird. I don't know if they're trying to like maybe even do some kind of weird commentary about like gay or cross dresser
Like
or something
gender
like that.
norms,
Like,
probably.
yeah,
Yeah.
kind of like, oh, this guy's bad because he's wearing the ruby
Yeah.
slippers,
Well, I
so it's
I think
just
that's a good
yeah.
point. Now that the ruby slippers are on a male character, right? Like he's
Yeah.
the villain. Um, and well, I mean, also think of this was the '80s, right? So Elton John, Prince, Michael Jackson, Bowie,
David Bowie. Yeah.
all these people in were challenging gender norms. So
Boy
it's so.
George. Yeah.
Hmm?
Boy George
Boy
from Culture
George,
Club.
right? So like this is sort of coming of the way, coming off of like a wave of like, well, I'm thinking Rocky Horror, right? That was the
Well, and
'70s, but
it's during the height of the AIDS epidemic
mhm,
too in the 80s too. So I mean, you've got this, And that's why, like, it's not overt. It's really not at all. Whatever the message is that they're saying about the villains of this piece, it's very much not overt at all. And I don't know if they're necessarily even going for this, but it's something upon watching this now 40 years later that you can see kind of like, are they trying to say something about this? Is this something they're really trying to point out? And if so, it's subtle. It's not super subtle, but it's
Yeah.
subtle enough,
Well,
you
by
know?
the 80s, I think it was pretty understood, if not like by most people, by certainly creatives, that The Wizard of Oz was pretty um, embraced by the queer community.
Yeah,
In
yeah. I
terms
mean,
of,
there's a whole thing. I mean, I'm
yeah,
assuming you've heard of it. The gay community is called the Friends of
Friends
Judy,
of Dorothy.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, Friends of Dorothy. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Because
and that was the secret code was like, are you a friend of
are you
Dorothy?
a friend of Dorothy? Yeah,
And then very much like connecting to this story of someone who feels like they can't relate to their sort of like mundane American life, that there's something
right,
different about them, and then they're whisked off into like a bright, colorful world,
right.
and so and it's very interesting, right? You talk about like the AIDS epidemic. That was a very dark time for the queer community. So to see a very dark version of Oz here,
Yeah,
I wonder if there is sort of an
yeah,
interesting parallel. At least it's coming from like the creatives behind it, because a lot of
right.
queer people in Hollywood. Just gonna,
Oh
FYI.
yeah,
Yeah, there's any
right.
viewers out there. We're in there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and it speaks to a lot of what was going on in the 80s in general. The 80s were kind of a dark time. Like we look back on it and we're all like, "Oh yeah, bright neon, everything's cool and everything like that." The 80s were not that great, like
yeah.
when you really think about it. I grew up then, I didn't like it. We had the satanic panic of the time.
Hmm.
We had, and that shit's coming back around again because people are morons. And
If you
then
don't learn,
well, some of us do, some of us don't.
yeah.
But we had that was the rise of it was kind of the rise of the serial killer era,
Mhm.
and child abductions and everything. So, it's definitely a dark era for America in a lot
Yeah.
of ways.
Well,
That it's so
people don't, people have a hard time separating pop culture from culture, right?
right,
And so pop
exactly.
culture was often a distraction from what was
Yeah,
happening underneath, which is why like the flappers of the 20s, we think about that, but then we don't think
right.
about all the crash that happened immediately
Yeah,
after, and like a lot of stuff, right?
right.
No, but yeah, no, amazing points.
Yeah. No, it's just I think it's interesting to put it into the context of the time. Like, they're trying to evoke a certain time period about being in the, pre-1900s, but it's also informed by the reality of our time, and the
Yeah.
80s and stuff. So, definitely bringing in some of those sensibilities, that and it was something that, when I watched it originally, I didn't notice because, I was a kid, but now, being, 50 years old now, that I can look back and go, there's some weird stuff here that they may or may not be saying. And again, like I said, it's not very overt, but you kind of have to wonder if they were trying to say that.
Oh, 100%. There's always something under
Yeah.
the surface. I know a lot of people don't like to look for the messages in their
Right.
movies sometimes, but they're there, right? As an artist,
Yeah.
like if you're writing something, there's something that inspired the thing that you were writing, and there is a
Right.
message there. People generally don't just create, whimsical
Yeah.
stuff, and it's just like, oh, whatever. There's no meaning behind it.
Right.
There's meaning
Exactly.
behind everything we do.
Yeah. Well, and
Um,
I think that's what's interesting about stuff too, is because you do have those people who are just like, well, just watch it for the baseline, thing that the very surface level. And it's like you can watch it that way, and I don't have a problem with that, but you can't deny. I mean, if you are denying that there's something deeper there, then you're not a very good movie watcher. You're not a very good person to absorb media.
Right. I was gonna say there's
Because
like
like you
art
said,
and there's entertainment, and there's very little
yeah,
like entertainment that doesn't have some art. Right? These are artists. These are
right.
people who went to school for writing,
Yeah.
for all the stuff that they've done. Music creation. Whatever it is,
Yeah.
painters. Right? There's a meaning behind it. Like you
Yeah,
can't ignore
exactly.
it.
It's like people who are just like speaking of horror movies, because it's what we talk about, is that everybody's all like, oh, horror is not political. Horror is very political. Horror has always been political.
Absolutely.
It's just I don't know.
I'm
When
I'm
people
I'm I'm
don't
your
see that.
typical I'm your typical East Coast liberal, so I listen to NPR. And I was listening to there's this one show, and they were talking about the birth of the vampire, and like and
Okay.
how the vampire has changed over time, and there was actually a lot of racism steeped in vampire lore, because a
Yeah.
lot of vampires, this is probably like obviously pre desegregation and stuff like that.
Right.
A lot of vampires were given very stereotypical um, black traits, in terms of like scaring like innocent white Americans, and it was
Right.
very
Right.
really interesting stuff. But it's always like you said, horror is always political.
Right.
It always addresses
It's
something.
always addressing the time period
Yeah,
too, like what's going on, the whatever the anxieties of the time that the movie has come out is usually speaking to those anxieties. So
yeah. Well, I was just
yeah,
using this analogy too, is like when you look at like action movies. This is a big
yeah,
segue from Return to Us, but it you look at the villains in the 80s were always sort of like what was going on, the Cold War, right? So you're
yeah,
always sort of getting like your diehard kind of villains,
right,
right? And
yeah,
then post 9/11, obviously, then all the villains were some obscure Middle Eastern
right,
kind of
right,
character, right? So there's always a reflection on media from what's happening,
right,
you know.
yeah.
So let's segue back.
Segue back.
um, and so we find out that the Gnome King has then turned so people into stone, but then so he sort of did two things, right? So he turned people into stone, but then he also turned people into ornaments, objects,
Yes,
and that he
yeah,
was sort of stowing away in this sort of vault that he's had, right? As sort of a
right,
way to reclaim the emerald, the ruby, everything that
right,
was taken from him. So each of them, so TikTok, Jack, and Dorothy, um, and as well as Gump, Gump.
right.
I'm like playing Gump. I was like I'll
Gump.
call him like Grump or something. Um, have an opportunity to sort of they have to guess, like if they could pick, they have to guess which
Yes,
ornaments were people, essentially,
right,
as a way to
yeah.
save Scarecrow, Lionton, Magnolia.
Right. And it's initially Scarecrow, because she when they first get inside his cave,
Mhm.
they encounter Scarecrow. And it's interesting too because they went with different designs for these characters too.
Mhm.
They went for more of a almost like if you look at the pictures from L. Frank Baum's books and
Yes.
everything, they're much closer to those
They
renditions
weren't
than they
people in
are.
makeup, essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So it's interesting just to see that, I mean, it's been close to 50 years of movie making since then, and
Mhm.
technologies move forward. So, it's interesting to see the change in these characters. So when she does meet, Scarecrow, he's definitely still a guy in a suit, but it's much more, instead of having makeup on a face, it's actually like, a full-on
The
mask on
mask,
his
and
head
it's
and
very
everything. Yeah.
whimsical, and I love that.
Yeah.
I would never want to see a CGI version of these characters.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that they're practical, real made costumes, and even if they
Right.
look like, oh, it's obviously fake, right? It's not, the mouth
Yeah.
isn't moving, or this is, it just adds to the dark whimsy of the tone that
Right.
they're going for in such a
Yeah.
pretty
The
way.
fantasy of it all. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So everyone but Dorothy fails. So Dorothy goes in to wind up
Yeah. So
TikTok.
the Gnome King changes Jack, or uh Scarecrow into the ornament and explains the whole ornament thing.
Hmm.
And that they all have to they're each given three chances to do that. And each one of them goes in one at a time. So
Yeah,
until
and
TikTok goes in.
TikTok goes in, and then they're like, his action wind down, or like he's
Yeah.
just standing there.
Yeah.
And then Humpkin's like, all right, I guess you can go in and help him, and then stay in there
Yeah.
and do your turn.
Right. Yeah,
uh,
and so it's interesting too because they come up with a plan. He's still thinking, this whole time, and he's like, "Hey, if once I touch something, you can see what I turn into, and then that'll help you figure it out."
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
So
and then,
yeah,
but the
go ahead.
problem is that as soon as he touches something, like it goes dark, and she doesn't see what he turned into. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But she figures it out, right?
yeah,
Forgot what was it that kind of gave it away, right? Because the answer is that everything that people turned into was
was green.
was
Yeah, it
green.
was an emerald green.
But what
Yeah.
was the thing that tipped her off to it? I'm trying to remember.
I think she was just looking around and then she saw, I think it was a medal, like like a war medal type thing.
Hmm.
That or maybe no, that came later. Um, I don't know. I think she was just looking around and she saw something that was very green, very emerald looking, and and then she just took a chance.
Yeah, yeah. And then so everyone from Oz or Emerald City turned into Emerald.
Right.
And so obviously that pisses off the Gnome King. Uh, and so he tries.
Who, interestingly enough, starts out, it's interesting when they first
Mhm.
meet him, he starts out as this like CGI character, this animated character, it made from like claymation, not CGI. So it's
Yeah,
very claymation at first, and as it goes along, as each successive person fails, he gets more and more human like until it is actually just a dude in a costume. um
yeah,
who still looks very stone like, but it's definitely, you can tell it's changed from being, claymation and into puppetry, and then um into an
yeah.
actual guy with the makeup on. So I thought that was an interesting aspect too. As people are becoming less human, he's becoming more human.
I
So
do love that, and it's almost an interesting parallel to the Wizard, right?
yes.
Because when we see the Wizard, it's just this big, like,
Yeah.
you
So
know,
he's definitely the wizard person in this movie too. He's the
yeah,
analog for the wizard, and where Princess Mombi is um the witch
hmm,
aspect this time. So
yeah. And I love it, sort of like very similar to the Wizard, right? I like how you put it. It was just sort of like as he gets more angry or like he gets tested more, he becomes more human. Very
right,
similar to the Oz, who sort of the Wizard of Oz sort of goes from this like
right,
floating head into just more of a man with flaws,
right, right.
right? That
Yeah,
everything that's scary, or everything that all our challenges seem more scary at the beginning. Then when
right,
we start to face them, we shrink them down, right?
right.
Um, and then yeah, and so the thing that actually takes out the Gnome King, I just found very funny,
Yeah.
was that
Well,
Belina is
this whole time, the whole movie,
yeah,
the Gnome King and his minions have been scared of Belina, the
right,
chicken. Like for some unknown reason, they're just scared of this chicken. They're like, we don't want this chicken anywhere near us. So when they get to the Gnome King's mountain, Belina's hiding inside Jack Pumpkinhead's head.
yeah.
So
Oh yeah, right. So that's sort of where Belina is, right? And
yeah,
so Belina, I guess the whole thing is she had not been able to lay an egg this entire
yeah.
time, and the whole reason why they're afraid of chickens is that eggs are poisonous to them for
Apparently
some.
poisonous, yeah. But
Which
again, this goes into um the whole water being the thing that kills the wicked witch in the first movie.
right.
So it's this weird something natural, just is the weird thing that kills you. So
Yeah. No, I love that. It doesn't have to make
yeah.
sense. It's
No,
Oz logic, and that's okay.
exactly.
That's the fantasy of it all. Um, but then we sort of find out, and you were uh, alluding to this, is like then we find out who Princess Ozma really is. So do you want to go into
Right.
that?
Yeah, because once it's over, there Dorothy's able to help restore Oz back to itself. She uses the ruby slippers to restore Oz to its former grandeur, and gets everybody back from being stone. And so once she's there, everybody's like, "Oh my God, Dorothy, you saved us again. You should be the Queen of Oz." And she's like, "No, I got to go back." Which, why? Like, everybody doesn't believe you in the real world. You were literally about to be electroshocked. You should just stay there, Dorothy. But
The
she's just
guilt,
like, "No, I
man.
gotta go back." Yeah.
She
I
didn't
was
want to
like, "No, no,
break
no.
Annie M's heart.
You get it." Well, no, but it's like, okay, but what's there for
No,
Auntie M and Henry? bring
I get
them
it.
to Oz too. Like,
Mm,
if you're the Queen of Oz, you could do that,
fam.
presumably. But yeah, so she but she's just like, no, I gotta go. But then she sees the little girl and on the other side of the mirror, and she pulls her through, and they tell her, this is Princess Ozma of Oz that you saved. She's the daughter of the King of Oz, so she's the rightful ruler of Oz now. But the what they say is her father, the King of Oz, was the person who ruled Oz before the wizard got there.
Yeah.
And so it leads to this, and it's not really said or anything like that, but it leads to this really dark implication that the wizard killed her father and took over Oz, took over the
Right.
Emerald City and took over Oz. And so, which is interesting too, because this leads into the new Wicked movie. And I've never seen the play, so I'm assuming the book and the play and the movie are all based on the same idea that the wizard is actually a bad person and taking over everything. But then this is actually in the if this is directly from the books, that makes sense too. So that,
Yeah.
you know,
So I
all
don't
this
know
time
how
we thought the
much.
wizard was just like this huckster dude who
Yeah.
took advantage of the situation, but really he might have had something to do with, taking down Oz as it is.
Well,
So
absolutely believable. I'm not gonna spoil Wicked for when you do see it because I've seen the
yeah.
play a couple of times,
Okay.
and I've never read the book. So the book is darker.
Okay.
It's not based specifically on the Baum books, like the original books.
Right.
There's a trilogy, I think, or maybe four books, the
Yeah.
Wicked like series, where
Right.
he went back and actually just made his own sort of prequel sequel to the whole thing,
Yeah.
where they talk about the wizard and sort of
Yeah.
what the Wicked Witch obviously wasn't as wicked as we thought, and all
Right.
this, it is pretty dark. And I love the fact that so clearly the person who wrote Wicked under has read those books, I think,
Right.
because specifically with Belina being able to talk in the movie, that's a big part. Animals talking is actually a big part of Wicked. Is a
Okay.
whole thing about animals and
Interesting.
species. Well, there's a whole thing there.
Yeah.
Um, so the fact that Belina could talk is very, and I thought when I watched this movie was like that was where they were gonna go. Like they were afraid of Belina because she was a talking animal.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and
Yeah.
I was like, oh, like I thought like there was a little nod there because Wicked runs with that idea.
Right.
Um, so it's really interesting. But anyway, yeah. So this
Yeah.
whole thing with like Ozma and
Well, and
I
Ozma
love,
turns out to be the girl that was in the asylum with her, the one who's been washed away in
yeah.
the river and everything.
Um,
So,
and we did get a hint of that, right? Because we didn't talk about there's a lot of scenes here. It's hard to mention everything as we're going along the story, but we did get a moment where the witch was talking to sort of this ephemeral
yeah,
um girl figure,
right,
sort of keeping Ozma sort of at bay.
right, exactly.
And so yeah, so right, so Mombi was our parallel to the nurse, right? I'm assuming I didn't look
Yes,
this up. It was the Gnome King, the doctor?
the Gnome King was the doctor.
Right.
The nurse was Princess Mombi, and the Wheelers were the orderlies.
Where the
Um,
orc was.
you
Okay,
know, so
perfect. So we get
yeah,
so very similar to Oz. We're getting all these analogs, these sort of
yeah. Everybody who was in the real world is over there in the
mhm.
in Oz with her as well. Again, delusions.
Very dilute. Well, because then we find that Dorothy wakes up after she's been whisked away, right? When she returns home.
Right,
She's at the end of the river, her
right.
family finds her.
Yeah,
And then we find out that
Uncle Henry finds her throwing his cane to the side.
that's
Obviously,
it.
his legs. Obviously, Auntie Em was correct. His legs work fine.
Well, yeah. So he was,
Yeah,
yeah, clearly milking that, so
yeah,
he's like, all right, gotta get my niece here, which
yeah,
I would love to explore. I don't know if this is talked about in the books. What happened to her parents?
yeah. I don't know. Yeah,
I'd be
it's
very curious.
interesting.
Probably a very
Yeah,
dark origin. Obviously, they're dead. I'm assuming they're
yeah,
dead.
yeah. You would think. Yeah,
Dead parents are always the beginning of every child tragedy story,
right.
right? But
It
yeah, so they
works for
find
Disney.
her, and then we find out that the storm damaged the institution, and the doctor had died in a fire.
Yeah, he was the. Everybody was able to be saved except for the doctor
Except for the
because
doctor.
he went back in for his machines. And then as they're they're telling us, the nurse is for some reason being whisked away in this like wagon
Hmm.
cell. She's like being arrested for something. They don't really explain it. And it's like, well, what did she do that was so wrong? The girls escaped on their own. Like,
Yeah.
so it's not like she had anything to do with the one girl's possible death. Um, because they say, the other girl wasn't found. So
Yeah.
it's a little weird. And she's the only one who was arrested. If everybody else was, involved in whatever, maybe they're just like, oh, well, they were running a bad asylum.
I
So,
would imagine, but it's not like there were a lot
uh,
of restrictions and
yeah,
things back then. Like things were, it was kind
no,
of the wild west of mental health at that point.
right. Yeah,
Even well into the 60s, because that was when they really
yeah.
started cracking down on these asylums and institutions.
Right. Yeah. No,
But
it's
anywho,
been bad for a long time.
it was bad for a while.
Yeah.
And then, but she heads back home. She finds the key again, sort of confirming. Well, I
Right.
don't know if it really confirms per se, because she finds the key,
No.
which she found in before she goes to Oz,
Yeah.
and then she sees Ozma and Belina in the mirror. Still could be a delusion,
Supposedly. Yeah.
so we don't really know.
Well, and it's interesting too, because like this time she sees them in the mirror, and which was funny because Belina's just like, I'm staying in Oz. You go home, but I'm staying in Oz. Things are much better
It was
here.
like
What are
I
you
can lay
talking about?
eggs here, and they kill things, so I'm good.
Right. And so she's looking at the mirror and she's like, Auntie Anne, look, look. And Ozma's like, shh, like, don't say anything. And she's like, oh, okay, here. And let me put you up so Auntie Anne can't see. I'm like, okay, so now your delusion is like telling you just be quiet about it now.
Keep
So
the secret. Yeah, so there really
yeah.
is no confirmation that it was real.
No, it's very odd.
So what is like sort of the, I guess, the big I guess well, we talk about a lot of big takeaways, but as
Yeah.
far as like, yeah, this girl needs help, but maybe don't electrocute her.
Yeah. You would think, looking back on it now, this would kind of be more of an indictment on the mental health, industry of the time period,
Yeah,
which again was brand new. Nobody even thought about like up until this point, like they didn't really like they just jailed people like who were like or families just put their weird relative in the basement or something like that. It just
right.
locked them away.
You know,
So
yeah,
it's just thing like you said, things have only really within these last 50 some odd years really only started to sort of get better. It was getting better for a little while and then it kind of got and now it's gotten worse again. So
yeah. Well, that's
um
what we talk about. Funding,
yeah,
right, and
yeah,
that kind of stuff, right? So I think
yeah,
yeah, I think this is an interesting thing about mental health. I
yeah,
would actually really, I do appreciate that as a sort of a
yeah,
takeaway, especially like paying attention to these things and getting proper
yeah,
care. And I love, so I do
right.
love that. But yeah, man, this is a wild '80s movie. I'm so glad I finally watched it.
Yeah. Now this was your first watch, right?
This was my first watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said,
This
like
was this was my first watch in a long time. Like I'd seen it in the 80s and I know I'd shown it to my kids, but I don't know if I watched it when they watched it. I was just like, here, watch this crazy thing.
yeah,
And so, it's just yeah, good looking back on it, it was just like the hell were they thinking in the 80s that they thought this was because this is what was funny too, because the 80s was like full of this kind of stuff, these movies that were marketed towards kids that were really not great for kids when you look back on it. And they realized it in the early 90s and they kind of transitioned away from that. Things were still kind of dark, but there was more of a either a whimsicalness or lightness to it, because you can't really say that stuff like Goosebumps and stuff like that, which were horror, were really that scary in a lot of ways, like compared to like
uh,
this was almost like they weren't trying to do horror, but unintentionally ended up in horror.
well, that's it, right. Understanding like what's age appropriate, right? Well, like,
Yeah,
but also this movie was very grounded. Well, in the
yeah,
beginning, right? You talk about this asylum, and it was
yeah,
very like real scary
yeah.
versus like fantasy scary.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't just like a kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is like really dark thematically speaking
Yeah.
as well, right?
Definitely.
So it's cool. It was cool to see that shift. Well, in the '80s too is when we finally got the differentiation between PG and PG-13,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
that was
Well,
when
because they
that shift was
needed,
happening.
yeah. Well, because they needed a thing because of stuff like Gremlins and
Mhm.
Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where they were like they're not R rated, they weren't that intense, but they couldn't be PG anymore, which they
Right.
had been for a long time. Because there's some stuff you go back and look as PG that is like really like a lot more intense than you would think would be
Yeah.
allowed for that era. And yeah, so they were just like, yeah, we got to create a middle ground rating here, and PG-13 is what they came up with.
Right.
So
Because it was either right. It was either PG or R. And then for a while, it was like, remember in the beginning, like the early days of Hollywood, I think it was just like approved. Like
yeah,
you
yeah,
just had you had a movie just had a pass. So like everything was
yeah.
kind of essentially G at one
Well,
point.
sort of, because they did, before the MPAA came around, there was the Hayes Code,
Hmm.
which was which they were trying to you know, kind of police, because in the 30s and 40s things started to get darker tones and stuff. There was a lot more death and violence
Like
and
mobster
drug use
movies,
and stuff like
noir.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, really the noir stuff. It was kind of this like the McCarthy era esque
Hmm.
type of stuff, where in the 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s era, where they really started cracking down on a lot of that stuff, because they were just like, that's too impressionable on our kids.
Right.
um which is just like,
Well, the
and then in the
puritanical
80s.
panic was setting in, right? It
Oh,
was
yeah,
very
yeah,
right, and that's where we've been fighting that battle since.
too much, yeah. Oh my god, it's it's too much, man. I just And it's cycled back, which is weird. It's like we should be way past this at that point. So,
History. We are doomed to repeat it.
oh man,
It is wild, but hopefully a little bit more wise, and hopefully with people who care to fight the fight,
yeah.
right? For so we can have movies like this, a
Well, and
lot
that's what's
more of
interesting.
this.
Like I said, it doesn't, you don't get movies like this anymore. You don't get these darker tinged movies that were for kids,
Yeah.
so
And I'm genuinely
that
not
were
afraid to show this
literally,
to my son. I don't think it's that bad of a movie
no,
in the sense of
no.
like, I think he could handle it. He likes, and my
I'm,
son, he's only 2, but he likes being scared. I can tell I'm
yeah,
going to bring him to the dark side because he loves a good jump scare. Cracks up. He digs it. I'm like,
yeah.
jeez.
Which is what you should be doing. Yeah, you should. It's fine to have that jolt and then just be like, yeah, that was scary.
Yeah. Oh,
You
and he
know.
craves it. He's such a and
Yeah.
he's such a roughhouser too. I'm like, he loves to be thrown everywhere.
Yes.
Like, good. There we go.
Yeah.
Bring him to
That
my side.
was
We're
so
roller
funny.
coasters and horror movies. We're gonna have a blast.
Yeah. No, that's it's really funny too, because I'm well known, within, maybe on my podcast and everything, that I showed my daughter Seed of Chucky at the age of 3, um unintentionally, not knowing just how weird it was going to be, because I hadn't even
Sure.
watched it yet. It was the first time I was watching it, but she fell in love with it at that point, and so I was just like, all right, here, I'm glad you like horror. But she
Yeah.
like kind of got out of horror for a while, and then
Sure.
eventually found her way back into it.
And
So
fortunately, like most of the things that like would be like inappropriate go over their heads anyway, right? Like,
yeah, yeah,
you know what I
exactly.
mean? They're
Then
not gonna know what the turkey baster's for. You know what I
yeah, yeah,
like they're
yeah,
not gonna they're not registering that.
right, yeah. It's
So
just
like
like when you watch cartoons nowadays too. There's so many adult jokes, and you're just like, oh my god, this doesn't seem appropriate. Kid doesn't understand any of that. They go back, watch it again, and they're like, when they're older, like literally, my kids have gone back and rewatched stuff like SpongeBob. They're just like, oh my god, these jokes.
right.
How did these jokes, like, you didn't know? You didn't know what these jokes meant. You were falling for the sight gags. Meanwhile, the parents are laughing because there's the adult jokes in them.
Right, right.
So
Until you're
yeah,
like, oh, yeah, right, until you actually get like sex education as a 13,
right,
14 year old, you're not going to realize,
right.
like it's just, yeah, exactly. Like those jokes
Yeah.
are for us.
Yeah, they make those cartoons and stuff like that for all ages, so that we can endure them and we're not bored while you guys are watching them constantly.
Oh, man. Yeah. So good, though. All right. Well, this was so much
Yeah,
fun. I really enjoyed this
yeah,
movie. I'm so glad we got to talk about it.
yeah. No, definitely. It's a lot of fun. And if you like this movie, if you watch this movie and you want to hear me talk about more of 80s kinder trauma movies, come check out my podcast, Creepy and Geeky. I'm doing a whole series on them. I'm taking a break for the month of August from putting out episodes, but I'll be back in September, and I'll be doing that series then.
Excellent. Awesome. Yeah, no, please check it out. And then for Horrific Heroes, we're finally gonna get to do Spawn. That is
Yeah.
definitely the next episode. It's just
Yes.
it's a lot to read. It's a lot of comics, but we're sticking to the first 3 years of
Yeah.
comics, so not as
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
The movie and the animated show. So for
Right.
everyone, that's your homework. Come back and
Yes.
join us, and we're gonna talk at least that chunk of Spawn. Although,
Right.
funny enough, they did just announce that Blumhouse, the story arc for Blumhouse is going to be, I guess, a newer arc.
On,
So I might have to,
on King Spawn. Yeah.
I'm going to have to skip ahead and maybe read that later
Yeah.
on. But maybe
Well,
I'll.
from what I've understood, though, too, is that right around just before 300, issue 300 or something, there's a really good jumping on point or really kind of a redo of the whole series.
Okay.
And so that's how they kind of jump back into it. I could be wrong about the issue, but I think that's where a lot of people said jump back in just before issue 300, the lead up to 300, and then because they're around 350 now.
Oh, okay.
And then around 300 is where King Spawn, the Scorched, and Gunslinger Spawn all come out as well.
Oh,
So it
okay.
becomes this whole Spawn universe thing that's going on now.
Very
So
cool. All right, that's good to know
yeah,
then. Because
yeah,
then I'll start with the beginning, so that we, and
yeah,
then maybe we'll return to Spawn
right,
with some of the newer stuff, especially as the new movie comes out. It'll be fun to
right,
talk about it here. But
yeah,
yeah.
definitely,
Well, thank you everyone for checking us out. Again, this has
yeah.
been Horrific Heroes, Steve and Rob. We hope to see you in a couple of weeks for our Spawn episode.
Let's hope so. If
All
we can
right.
get caught up on it, yeah,
We'll get there. We'll get there. All right.
yeah,
See you guys
definitely.
then.
Bye.